lecture, and like all the lectures since early last week, it's very much directed towards helping you write your policy briefs. I want to go through a couple reminders, things I announced on Monday. First, just a reminder about handing in the composition books. There are specific instructions posted on the course website, both where the assignment is, and there's a separate announcement, I believe, as well. But you can bring those composition books in on Monday or Tuesday of next week. I extended that composition book deadline because it occurred to me that you might well want to have your composition book still with you as you're writing your policy brief. I've also just been, adding little prompts and details to the policy brief assignment, just as I hear your questions. So, and again, all with the idea in mind of helping you write this thing. So, let me share the current text of that with you. Okay, so I just added a couple things and sort of slightly reorganized this just to help you think about, like, what are you supposed to write about when you write about these different policies, when you're still like mainly analytically summarizing them. So here are the questions that, these are just prompt questions. I don't mean for you to like answer these questions one after the next or something. It's not a formula like that. It's just the idea is just these are questions that will help you think about what to say, what to write about each of the policies that you discuss. Remember, overall, I want you to discuss 4 policies, and then you're going to focus on assessing 2 in particular. So whose policies are they? How do they justify them? So you want to step back and not just focus on exactly what the proposal is, but how they justify. What's their analysis of AI and of the economy, perhaps, that leads them to propose this policy? And then, of course, what is the policy? How would it work? And especially, how would it achieve the goals that they are claiming? So again, that may sometimes require you to kind of step back and like fill in some details. Like, what's the connection between this policy and the thing that the proposer says is a problem that needs to be solved? In some of these cases, I think you may feel like there's more detail needed, and in that case, I'm just be explicit about it. Like, there's not quite enough detail. Like, what exactly would it mean to regulate AI as a utility? Like, some of the language about this in the policy we're going to talk about today, one of them is kind of broad. So you can just acknowledge that, but then try to fill in, like, think about, what exactly does this mean? What might it mean? And so on. And you can also consult other works if you need to. It's not mandatory, but if you think that for example, at one point Sanders and that Senate committee proposed passing what they call the PRO Act, PRO, the PRO Act. Well, it's pretty easy to find summaries. They don't say much about what the PRO Act is, but it's fairly easy to find online summaries of what the PRO Act is. So, if you decide to do that, and I'm not saying you have to, but if you do that, just cite it in your works cited and use it there. You don't have to do it. Anyway, these are just this is just meant to sort of help you think, like, what are you supposed to put in this? And some of this analysis of policy alternatives may spill, with the policies that you're going to focus on, may spill over into the policy recommendations portion of your essay, of your brief. That's fine. There's not an absolutely sharp distinction between what goes into the policy alternatives portion and the policy recommendations portion. There are going to be things that sort of spill over, so that's fine. Okay, so all that's just meant to give you more information. I'll stop there and see if anyone has questions. Okay, doesn't necessarily look like it. Okay, so back to sharing the slides, I think. Let me see. Since there have been no questions, I must say, I don't know if you've ever, if you yourself have ever addressed a Zoom meeting, and rather than just being a participant, but it's really disconcerting to talk into a Zoom meeting and you don't see anyone's faces and there's no reaction at all. So how about some thumbs up telling me that you've heard me and that I'm not just speaking into the void. Excellent. Thank you. Good. 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 Still missing from some people, but hopefully they're there. Hopefully they're here too. Thank you. Okay. Okay, so this is what we've been doing. And today we're going to be talking again we're going to be talking about a set of policies in the latter half of the lecture today. And we're going to start off by reviewing some ideas and concepts and arguments from the unit that we did on work and employment and labor. And with the idea, of course, of connecting some of that to what we're focusing on here in AI. So this is where we've been so far. We did the same thing. We talked about markets, and then we tried to apply that to AI. Then we looked at these reports on different views of what the effect of AI may be on jobs and employment. Then, I had you think a little bit about the connection between the unit on entrepreneurs and capitalists and corporations and AI. And then we had a discussion Monday about AI and inequality, and we connected that to AI. And then we looked at a couple of policies. We looked at the White House action plan, and we looked at the Asameglu and co-author article on building pro-worker AI. Today, I guess I don't have a slide for you for the discussion. That's mainly going to be on Poll Everywhere anyway. But today we're going to be looking at the Buck and Huber articles and the Sanders article. Okay, so let's go to a discussion. That's where we're going to start today about connecting ideas about labor and employment to AI. So let's start with just a little straightforward review. No. Okay, just the meaning and significance of the labor theory. Okay, still gonna wait for a couple more answers before I start narrating. Okay, good. So we've got, let's start with the very basics. Yeah, so here, I'll take this statement of it. People gain ownership, they gain property through mixing their labor through something. And in the language that Locke uses, it's mixing, people mix their labor with the fruits of the earth, with the earth itself or with the fruits of the earth. It's still a very, in some ways, it's a phrasing that reflects a time when agriculture is still a substantial, it is really by far the most substantial portion of the economy. So it's very much reflect. So it's a kind of agricultural understanding, but gaining ownership through mixing one's labor with earth or the fruits of the earth. So that's kind of definitional to what it is. The idea that the fruits of the earth or land become a person's property through labor. Then we want to move on to some more questions about this. Of course, this is famously Locke's idea, uh, and so people mention Locke here. Uh, it's a justification for property for sure. Yeah, interesting to say that it's an alternative to, say, inheritance and so on. Here, right? This is important, right? So it's fundamental for Locke that one has a property in oneself, right? And people have argued about this phrasing, and there's a whole debate about it. But let's focus on the key thing that Locke is trying to convey, which is something about sort of about the idea of human autonomy. And Locke's idea is that God intends human beings to be autonomous, to say that someone else has property in you is the most fundamental way that you can deny somebody's autonomy. And so Locke is insistent that it's a feature of natural law. It's part of God's intention that you have control of your body. And since you have control of your body and yourself, you must have control of your labor. That to be able to control your labor is really fundamental. And for some people in the modern world, the language that sort of focuses so heavily on God's intention, may be troubling. But I think you can sort of put that aside and just say that Locke is saying it's like just a fundamental proposition that we should never doubt that people must have control over their own labor. Um, let's see, what else do we have here? Yes, so this is deeply related to this suggests that labor for Locke is deeply related to what it is to be a human being, right? So remember also, I'm not going to necessarily look for this in your answers. God Locke says God commands man to labor. And again, you might sort of rebel at that particular sort of theological phrasing of it. But in a simple way you can put that is, Locke is asserting that to labor is fundamental to what it is to be a human being, that it's fundamental to your humanity. And also, this idea of common natural resources, right? So Locke has this problem, which is he has to explain how it is that people can have individual property, given that the earth is given to human beings in common. Both sides of that proposition, both the idea that the earth is given to human beings in common and the idea that an individual must have some way of obtaining individual property and some individual thing. Both sides of that are related to Locke's idea that God intends human beings to be able to live. They have a right to subsistence. And that right to subsistence, the most natural way to fulfill your right to exist, to support your own existence, the most natural way to do that is through labor. Now, again, we've become very separated in time from Locke, and we have in some ways only sort of sort of faint echoes of what he's trying to say. But those fundamental ideas about labor being fundamental to what it is to be a human, the idea that labor connects us to other human beings, because it allows us to help other beings to subsist, that it's connected to our right to subsist, that it's the most natural way for us to fulfill our right to subsist. Those are kind of deep assumptions for Locke. However, you may think that Locke's ideas then become later used, and there's some diversity in how those ideas were used. Okay, good. So let's move on to another question. Uh, Okay, explain the meaning and significance of fictitious commodity. As much as possible, do try to use your own words here, um, right? Because the exercise is really to for you to be exercising your own intellect here. Okay, I think we have enough answers to start looking. Okay, so definitely this is a concept, part of its significance. It comes from Polanyi. And let's see. Sure, this is, oops, already moving. Something, right, for Polanyi, right, so this idea of a fictitious commodity especially means for Polanyi, I mean, we could say kind of generally, something that is bought and sold that is not intrinsically a commodity, but then we'd want to fill that in a bit, like, well, why? Why isn't it, and what do we mean when we say it's not intrinsically a commodity? And for Polanyi, especially, for something to be a commodity, it's not simply enough that it is bought and sold, but it must be something that was made to be bought and sold. And so for Polanyi, the fictitious commodity has the particular meaning of something that is in fact bought and sold, but was not made for that purpose. And as people here note, land and labor and money are the three primary examples for Polanyi. And of course, here we're interested particularly in labor, and of course, the idea about labor, labor is not a commodity, right? It is, as this person says, it's human activity. Again, this is very much like Locke, right? There's something when people start to think about the relationship, about the significance of labor. People as different as each other as Locke and Polanyi, they revert to something kind of similar. This idea about the idea of sort of one's activity being sort of intrinsic to oneself. Let's see what else people say here. Right, so this is a repetition of something that I already said. Yeah, so commodification of these things can have negative consequences for sure. So one thing that I don't see here that's good to point out, and again, very, very connected to Locke, is this idea that human activity, you can't separate it from yourself, right? You can't leave, you can't give your activity to somebody else. It's you. It's you. Your activity is you, either whether it's mental activity, whether it's physical activity. It's not something that you can hand over to someone else. The way, like, if I decided to, I'm rather fond of this coffee cup, but honestly, I bought it at Crate and Barrel. I could sell it to one of you, and there would be nothing. I would not be doing harm to myself in selling this to you and giving you control over it. But the circumstances under which I give my labor to you, may be beneficial to me, but they can also be quite harmful to me. So there's something very significant about the way that your labor is inherent in yourself. And again, this is a Polanyian idea, but it's connected to the Lockean idea. Okay, so I think these are concepts I think you want to have in mind here as you're thinking about this unit. Okay, so that was just to that's almost pure review, and now I want you to think a little more. And if you answer this next question, if there's some repetition, that's fine. Uh, whoops. Okay, so what are some concepts or claims from any previous unit of this course? Again, if you want to repeat some things we've already said, that's fine. Relating to the nature of labor, or what makes labor significant, or what makes labor distinctive or unique, and what role those who labor should have in the shaping of the economy. Any of those things. And here you can you might just simply name a concept, or you might, say like so and so makes such and such an argument. Okay, any of those things. Okay, so still going to wait for a couple more, few more answers to appear. Okay, good. Let's see what we've got here. Autonomy, I think, is crucial here. So labor is very closely linked for various authors. For example, for Locke, to the idea of the importance of human autonomy, right? And of course, where we're going here is trying to think about how you could then bring this idea of human beings on autonomy, how you could bring that to bear on questions about AI and the future of labor and employment. The labor theory of property, right? So there's a lot there that you could that speaks to the significance and to the uniqueness of labor. So just for example, just to repeat something I was just saying to you about Locke, right? So fundamental here for Locke is this idea that human beings have a right to survive, and labor is the most natural way for them to support that. And so, and it would, so that would, it would be wrong to deny people the right to subsist, but it would also be wrong to deny people the right to labor in order to achieve that goal of subsistence. Uh, Autonomy, of course, is closely related to freedom. Dewey, I think, is a key figure here. So you might think about Dewey and what he says about freedom and work, right? Uh, and then as long as you're thinking about Dewey, I don't see this here, Rawls, fictitious commodity, Marx, um, I'm not seeing this here, but Dewey's idea of individuality, right? This idea that that every person has this unique capacity to create, and that this is something that can be fulfilled through work and through labor. And thinking about sort of what's valuable about that, and Dewey takes that immediately then to some claims about how work and employment ought to be structured, right? But you can pause on it and just think about, well, what's important about individuality for Dewey, and how might this relate to AI? We went over this just very briefly, and I'm not surprised that everyone's forgotten this because we talked about this so quickly. But I want to call your attention to a quote in a passage that I posted from Marx, because Marx brings together a bunch of these ideas in a particular passage. So let me share this with you, and this is posted. You can find this. If only that I can find how to share it with you. Come on, please. No. Oh, yeah, there we go. Okay. Is everyone seeing this PDF uh, with the stars and then a passage next to it that says, supposing we had produced in a human manner? Excellent. Okay. I posted this, and I think I just had something very brief to say about this. But this really, as opposed to Marx's idea of alienated labor, this is Marx's description of what labor could be like under ideal circumstances, if people were able, more able to create freely and creatively. Uh, so I'm not going to read it to you. Maybe I'll give you 1 minute to just read it, and then I'm going to say a couple things about it. By the way, I particularly just mean the parts that are kind of underlined here and with stars next to it. So I think a couple things are going on in this passage, and again, you know, very crudely, someone might say, well, Locke is a sort of predecessor of pro-capitalist thinking. It's a little bit crude, but you could sort of say that. And Locke and Marx obviously is a socialist, a communist, and so they're obviously quite different from each other. But when it gets to some of these sort of fundamental ideas in the history of political thought about labor, there's often a kind of resonance between people who are otherwise quite different in their assumptions. So, one thing here that you see is that Marx is insisting on the idea that there's something humanly satisfying about producing something. And that seeing something, taking an idea in my head and producing it in the world where other people can see it. There's a satisfaction of a kind of creativity, right? So for Marx, there's this idea of species being, and then there's a satisfaction for someone else in using something that another person has created, right? So I mean, like think about this maybe in a sense of like a people who know each other, but a satisfaction in consuming a meal that is cooked by someone that you know, right? So that through that satisfaction, through that meal, you're kind of having a relationship with that other kind of person. And Marx is sort of talking about that. And then bringing it back again, there's the idea that there's satisfaction in seeing another person satisfy their needs through work that you have done, right? You see these multiple layers of sort of satisfaction through creativity and laying out your work in the world and enjoying the fact that something that I have made has satisfied another person, has met a need in another person. And of course, then all this is related to what happens when work is not well organized according to Marx, and there's all these problems of alienation. But all this idea about sort of what's something that's sort of fundamentally satisfying about labor, about your own creativity, and about producing things that you can be proud of and you can look at in the world. This is Marx is someone who expresses this, I think, quite well. Okay. Last question that I want to ask you. This is a little bit harder. You may not remember, but excuse me. So specifically in the unit on AI, can you think of any place where any of the people we read talk about the significance of labor, the distinctiveness of labor, why labor is valuable? Can you think of examples of that? Okay, we're starting to see some good answers here. Um, so I think what a lot of these answers are seeing is kind of like what's at stake, right? So clearly, this idea of AI as a substitute and possibly as a substitute for like all of human labor, right? That's kind of that's really the ultimate stake here. But I guess the question is like, why should we care, right? So we already talked. So in the last discussion, we already talked about, well, this is problematic from the standpoint of like, where are people going to get their income? How will this affect inequality? But here I'm also looking for like, well, is there something about labor that is sort of distinctive and especially valuable so that it would be a loss for people no longer to labor? That would be a loss. And definitely we can see the answer from the standpoint of someone like Locke, from the standpoint of someone like Marx, from the standpoint of someone like Polanyi. And by the way, in Kuttner, you can see some of this. He's not sort of talking about this in sort of high philosophical terms, but a lot of what he's saying sort of echoes all these things. But now what I'm asking here is, besides like this, what's at stake, like the possibility that there will just no be, as Amode puts it, the possibility that there'll be no economic value for human labor in the future. And here, but does Amode or anyone else in the AI unit kind of give you a sense of like why that could be a loss? And I think here somebody says no. Uh, uh, they don't really see that. So I just want to point out to you that there is just the very faintest suggestion of a worry about this in Amode. And he puts it in a peculiar way. He says, in the future, human beings are going to could be confronted with the fact that they're not the best at something or at anything. And then and it's just the faintest sense of like what's lost if humans no longer labor. But it's an odd one because, of course, most people don't derive their sense of self-worth from thinking that they're the very best at something, right? There's almost nobody in the world who can say that. You might think, oh, I'm the best in my group at something, but that's not what Amode is talking about. But I think that in a faint way, Amode is kind of getting at this idea of loss. When humans no longer labor, or if humans no longer labor, if there's no longer a need. And so I just want you to see that even though it's not very well developed in Amode, it is suggested there. And there is a place I want to point out to you in the Buck and Huber articles where they talk about the dignity of labor. Very brief reference. But I think what I'm trying to get across to you is that although these references in the AI readings are very brief and not very elaborated and well articulated, they are getting at something like what Locke is getting at, like what Marx is getting at, and so on. So I just want you to see that it's not as if these considerations are unavailable to some of these people who are writing about AI. I don't, I don't blame you for saying that for some of these tech billionaires, a chef cooking a meal and the same thing being done by a robot are identical. I don't blame you for thinking that's the attitude they have. I think to a large degree it is. But Amodi is interesting because he's more complicated, I think, than some of these figures. And complicated people are often more interesting to read and to think about. Okay, all right. So all of this again is just trying to help you connect, what we've already seen about labor and employment and work, to make connections to AI for your papers. Because again, your assignment is to assess to assess two of these policies from the standpoint of inequality and from the standpoint of work and labor. So I'm trying to help you sort of think about what those connections might be. Okay, so let's now, in our remaining time, let's look at two of these. Look at two of these policies. And by the way, it happens, and I'll make note of this. It happens that just today in the New York Times, uh, uh, Bernie Sanders has an op-ed on AI, and I'm going to talk about this. So, and I think because it's very short. It's an op-ed, so typical op-ed pieces are, I don't know if you know this, the typical length for an op-ed piece in a newspaper is 800 words, very short. So it's short and sweet, and it's also a little bit more clear actually than some of the policies articulated in that Senate report that I assigned you. And it just came out today, so I'm going to post it. You can look at it. I'll say something about it today. Okay, but let's go. Let me share this. Go back to sharing slides. Okay, so let's talk about the Buck and Huber articles. And again, just for consistency, I'm showing this to you in terms of the different risks identified by Amode and lining them up against sort of what these policy authors are focused on. So again, fairly obviously, Amode has this sense of like four different kinds of risks, only one of which is what he calls economic disruption, but what he really means is the end of human work. What about, oh, darn, sorry, I didn't change this slide. I'm sorry, this up top here, this should say the focus of Buck and Huber. Sorry about that. I don't want to, hold on a second. I don't want to confuse you. Mm. Okay, sorry, just didn't, on this day of all days, I didn't want to have anything up there that was confusing or misleading. Come on. Okay, here we go. Okay, so Holly Buck and Matt Huber have these articles. There are two different ones that I assigned you. AI worker displacement is a serious threat, and treat AI like a public utility. And of course, the main proposal is treat AI like a public utility. So, but again, remember, as I ask you to assess these to write this policy brief, I'm asking you not only to look at the policy, but to look at how the policy is justified, how it's supported. And so that has to do with the analysis that they offer, in these articles. And roughly speaking, between these two articles by Buck and Huber, the first article is a little more kind of analysis of AI, and the second article is a little more of a policy proposal. But so some of what they talk about is like, well, how much of a threat is AI right now? They note that there are predictions of massive job losses, exactly the same things that we've been talking about. They talk about the worry that hold on a second, I gotta do something for my laptop doesn't power. Okay. They talk about this risk that AI will turn out to be a substitute for labor rather than merely an augmentation or a supplementation. And then it's an interesting conversation, an interesting debate that they engage in. These are articles that were published in a magazine. It was mainly an online magazine called Jacobin, which is a kind of it's relatively new as American magazines, political magazines go out. It's only about 15 years old or something, and it's a left-wing magazine. It's a kind of democratic socialist magazine, and they note that a lot of people on the left. There's some people who are kind of skeptical about the risks of AI, and this is interesting to read. It's worth engaging and thinking about, but I'm not going to say a lot about that right now. And they know what the different policies are that people have proposed. They know that that the standard proposal on the kind of sort of social democratic left, the standard response to something like AI would be welfare state proposals. So improve unemployment insurance, work on programs that help displaced workers. But they say like they argue basically those programs that are underdeveloped in the U.S. and they may not be adequate to deal with AI. Then they talk about universal basic income. And this is not a proposal that they're putting forth. And so don't be too worried about it, but let me just say briefly what universal basic income is. Universal basic income is this idea of like basically a guaranteed payment that every person would receive. The idea is universal, everyone gets it. A universal payment, a cash payment that every person receives. And you could say like, well, if work is being replaced, if no one's going to labor in the future, then people need some way of having money to support themselves. And universal basic income could be such a thing. It's universal because everyone gets it. It's basic because the idea is it's not necessarily an extremely generous payment. Maybe you need to find other ways to supplement it. And what they note is that although this sounds like a kind of left-wing proposal, a lot of the tech capitalists are advocates of UBI. People like people like some of the figures like Amadei and Altman and so on have proposed things like UBI. And here's where, remember I said to you that Buck and Humer talk about dignity. They say, but the problem with UBI is it ignores issues about the dignity that attaches to work. And they say that in all societies, there's some kind of dignity that goes along with work, which is not a reason to reject UBI, but it's a reason to think that UBI might not be an adequate response to the changes that AI could bring about. And so their focus then is really on this idea of treating AI as a utility. And the idea is very much like electricity. Electricity and water are probably the primary examples in the US of a market, of a good that is treated like as something that is crucial for the public. And they note that that a lot of things that you can say about electricity are also true of AI, right? So part of the justification for treating electricity as a utility, first is that there's like massive infrastructure that has to be built, and it would be incredibly wasteful to duplicate that infrastructure, right? If there were like 5 power companies in your area, and each one had its own set of power lines, and each one, built a connection to your house, right? That would be incredibly wasteful and duplicative. And so the idea is like, part of the idea of a public utility is like you say, like, okay, we're going to allow you to be a monopoly, but in return, and that's going to be great for you as a business, but in return, you have to sort of meet certain kinds of public demands. And they're saying that like, well, AI is a lot like that. Like given like the massive structure that has to be built, that actually people we're finding increasingly, people don't want these AI data centers built near them, given how huge that infrastructure of data centers is going to have to be, and all the power grid to get to it, and then of course the sort of internet connections or whatever those connections are that connect you to that compute. That's very much like the electrical grid. So they're arguing that they're making an analogy to electricity. And the reason is they're saying the same reasons why we treat electricity as a public utility ought to be applied to AI. Then they say, well, what does that really mean? And here they're not very specific. Okay, so this is partly why I added that language to the assignment of like, well, if you don't think there's enough detail here, just be frank about it. Like say there's not quite enough detail. Think about what you might need to fill in. Think about what some questions are that you still have. What Huber and Buck primarily offer as a set of kind of principles that they note are the principles that are used in electrical utility regulation, and they're saying should apply also in the regulation of AI. So that's one is like reasonable rates. Everyone should have access to, just as the idea that everyone should have access to electricity and that rates should be reasonable. Same thing for everyone should have access to AI and the rates should be reasonable. So access, there should be public oversight. There should be transparency. Like we should understand what these companies are doing. The service, that to the degree that it's provided, should be reliable. And they talk about this general idea of an obligation to serve. I put this on the slide. There's an obligation to serve, like everybody, like nobody should be left out. Everybody should have access to AI. Now, you'll notice about this, one of the things that the more I thought about this policy and these articles, and the more I noticed is that there's a little bit of a gap between the analytical focus, right? The first article is especially about the job impact, the labor impact of AI. But the second article it doesn't really fully address that. So the motivation is, look, AI could have these tremendous effects on employment and on labor, but the policy focus on treating AI as a utility, it's not clear exactly how that's a response to the labor risks. So there's a little bit of a seeming mismatch, I think, here. I don't mean that like the AI treating AI as a utility. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I'm not trying to pass judgment on any of these proposals, but I just want you to notice that there's not a perfect coherence, and not a perfect matching of the risk that they're assessing and their answer to it. And they themselves say this. They say the utility idea. They say on page 7 that this utility idea it really doesn't get at the job displacement risk. Okay, so this is one of the major policies we're looking at this week. This idea of treating AI as a utility, and so let's talk about Sanders and his set of policies. Okay, so one set of policies. So there in the Senate report. Right, so there's this report so Sanders is the ranking member of the U.S. Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. As the ranking member, he had the minority staff produce this report last October, and there are a lot of different policies here. And then there's also this article. Actually, let me just show you this. I haven't done this yet because this literally just came out this morning, and I've been busy this morning. First of all, reading this and trying to assess it, but I haven't yet posted this for you, but I will. I'll just show you this article. Assuming everyone will cooperate with me. Right. Okay. So here's this article that just came out, or I don't know. I guess I now notice that this is dated June 1st. Maybe that was when it was published online, although I didn't see it then. I saw it when it came out today. It appeared in my old-fashioned actual newspaper. Okay. Yeah, so let's talk about Sanders. So first of all, I think it's best to sort of look at this article and read it alongside the Senate report. Even though it's the article itself, I think is actually pretty well done. So first of all, a lot of the background to in the Senate report is just about wealth inequality and income inequality in the U.S. And it's sort of making the case that you can't really understand what's going on with AI and work and labor without understanding the background of inequality, economic inequality in the U.S. So that's a large part of it. And then, of course, like a lot of people, they note all these dire predictions about AI and the way that it could substitute for human labor. So they happen to report like a McKinsey report about AI having the potential to automate work activities of 60% to 70% of what human labor now does. As opposed to Amode's prediction, like it could be 100%. They note that the companies have been doing layoffs and justifying them in terms of AI and so on. This is the Senate report that I assigned you by Sanders. So then they talk about in this report a variety of different kinds of policies. So one set of policies really has to do with increasing worker power, right? If you were to talk about like an overall strategy, there are a number of specific policies, but what all these policies, one set of policies that Sanders and this committee are proposing, it's various ideas of making workers more powerful. And basically, the nature of the argument goes something like this. Before we get into the specifics of what these policies are, this idea that the only way to make sure that AI and automation benefit workers is to empower workers. Like there's no incentive on the part of Sam Altman and Elon Musk and Dario Amodei. They don't have an incentive to make sure that automation happens in a way that benefits workers. And so if you want to make sure that AI benefits workers, you have to empower workers one way or another, according to this Senate report. But what the Senate report says, and historically I think this is true, is that labor law in the U.S. doesn't do a very good job of empowering workers. U.S. labor law is pretty weak, and so unions in this country have tended historically not to be as strong as they are in other countries. And so there's a kind of syllogistic argument here. Like the only way to empower workers the only way to make sure that AI benefits workers is to empower workers. In order to empower workers, you have to change labor law because existing labor law is weak. Therefore, in order to make sure that AI benefits workers, you have to make these labor law changes. Okay, so what are some of these labor law changes? And I mentioned this briefly to you before. They talk about the PRO Act. The PRO Act is basically a piece of legislation that's been proposed in a number of recent Congresses that make it easier for workers to organize. And so you might want to. So the Senate report says very little about this. But basically, some of the problems have in American labor laws, like when workers try to organize, often employers try to punish workers who are organizing, and they often get away with it because it takes a long time for the National Labor Relations Board to get around to investigating these instances. And the fines and the penalties for trying to coerce workers when they're trying to organize are very low. So the PRO Act would sort of get at some of those things. Relatedly, the Senate report says, well, um, when workers are trying to organize, that's their right. It shouldn't really matter what the employer thinks. People have a right to be represented by a union regardless of what the employer thinks. People should be able to bargain with the employer. Like it's not really a right that you should have conditional on the employer thinking it's okay. That it's a right that you have automatically. And so they propose here mandatory neutrality. So employers should just stand back when workers are organizing. Employers shouldn't be like trying to meet with workers and saying like, don't do this, it's a bad idea, and so on. And often those meetings, what they do in those meetings is employers will issue threats like, if you organize, we're going to close this plant down. If you organize, we're going to punish the workers who organized, and so on. So laws about mandatory neutrality. They talk about closing loopholes that leave gig workers out. So at the moment in most parts of the country, gig workers, people who work for like Uber or DoorDash, they're not covered by union laws. So the idea is make sure that those workers are also able to organize. So those might seem like a weird, that might seem like a weird mishmash of unrelated policies, like the PRO Act, mandatory neutrality, close loopholes that leave gig workers out. All of those things, might seem like kind of unconnected to each other, but they're all about sort of making it easier for workers to organize unions, which is all a way of sort of empowering workers. So I think that's the common thread that I think you want to be looking for as you're trying to understand what exactly it is that Sanders and this minority staff of this Senate committee are trying to propose. Then there's other policies that aren't exactly related to unions, but they're also about empowering workers. And I think the most important of these are they say that should be mandatory for workers in a company, even if there's not a union, that workers should be able to elect members to the board of directors of large corporations. Right? This is how it works in Germany. So Germany has what's called co-determination. So like the big companies in Germany, there are worker representatives on the board of directors, like big companies, like the big auto companies like BMW, et cetera. Workers in Germany get to elect members to the board of directors, and basically that would take a big change in federal law, and the Sanders committee is proposing the same. And again, just so you don't get lost here, the idea is how can you make sure that when a big company like Amazon or Ford or Walmart, that as they're adopting AI, how can you make sure that AI is benefiting workers? Well, if the workers are able to elect members of the board of directors, then they may be able to make sure that the way that AI is being adopted by these companies, is beneficial to workers. They also talk about mandating stock distribution. So again, in some companies, one of the benefits of being an employee is that you're paid not just a salary, but you're paid some stock that makes you a part owner of the company. And so they talk about mandating that. So making all companies pay their workers partly in terms of shares in the stock of the company. Okay, then there's a whole set of other categories, right? I said to you that there are a lot of proposals in this Senate report. Some of the others are neither related to unions nor related to non-union strategies for empowering workers. Again, the non-union strategies for empowering workers would be the stock distribution and allowing workers to, or mandating that workers be able to elect members to the board of directors. They talk about things like improving unemployment insurance. It talks about, and then it also talks about ending tax breaks for automation, right? So that what they point out is that in the existing American tax code, companies are rewarded for capital investments. They get massive tax breaks for investing in capital, but when they hire workers, there are actually taxes on employment, and they're saying that this needs to be kind of restructured so that companies are, instead of disincentivizing hiring and incentivizing capital, in the world of AI, there needs to be more incentives to continuing to employ people and maybe a reduction of incentives for replacing people with AI. And in particular, related to that, the Senate report proposes a robot tax. So they call it, they say it should be in specific, an excise tax, but a tax on robots. And I think the robot idea is particularly important because Sanders is concerned that these policies not only be policies for knowledge workers, white collar workers, but also for blue collar workers who may come to be concerned that they're going to be replaced by robots of different kinds, whether that's like, driverless cars or factory robots and so on. Again, there's a lot of different stuff in the Senate report by Sanders and his committee, but I'm trying to kind of help you classify what these different policy proposals are. Then there's this article that I've been displaying to you. This is a new proposal that Sanders had not come out with until the last couple of days. But I think it's so. This is actually one of the best expressed. Whether it's the best idea, I don't know. But this article is like actually really good at kind of articulating exactly what's the policy proposal and then doing a good job sort of saying like why is this a good proposal? And the particular proposal here is this idea of what they call and what other countries call a sovereign wealth fund. He says he's going to be soon introducing the American AI Sovereign Wealth Fund Act. And what this would be is a 50% tax, not a one-time 50% tax, but not on the income of companies like OpenAI and Anthropic. It would be a one-time wealth tax, and it would be an in-kind tax. So these companies would have to pay 50% of their shares to the U.S. government. So the U.S. government would become a 50% owner of all of these companies. And they say this is very much like the way countries that have large oil reserves have leveraged those oil reserves. So companies like Norway, and a less pleasant example is Saudi Arabia, just because of the authoritarian nature of the Saudi Arabian government. What Norway has said is like, okay, these oil reserves, these are a public resource. We're going to let oil companies have access, but the benefits need to go to Norwegian people and not just to the oil companies who are given access to this reserve. And the justification that Sanders offers here is that AI is kind of similar, right? So he argues, after talking about the risks of AI, and I won't kind of recapitulate that, he says basically, look, AI is something that was not created out of thin air. It wasn't. It's not like everything that AI thinks and says and does, comes out of the mind of Dario Amodei or Sam Altman. Instead, it was built on human collective intelligence. Like it read all of our books, it read all of our songs, our artwork, our journalism, our computer code, our scientific research, our videos, and it basically sucked all that up. And everything that AI says to you, every question that you ask AI, it answers in virtue of having like sucked all that stuff up. And it points out that a lot of that stuff was sort of sucked up and fed to these AI models without anyone's permission, without anyone's acknowledgement, and without acknowledgement. And so Sanders is arguing, you can agree or disagree, that basically all these AI companies have appropriated like centuries of human thought and labor. And so in return, the public ought to have a stake in what AI has become. And so that's the justification. They're saying it's a lot. It's just like treating oil, on the under the seabed near Norway as a public resource. AI should also be, and what AI can do should also be treated as a public resource. And they propose, in particular, this 50% tax and this sovereign wealth fund that then can be used to make sure that AI benefits people and that the proceeds go to people. So, the nice thing about this Sanders article that just appeared is it's the best articulated proposal that he really has. Okay, I can see that I've gone over a minute, but I hope that was helpful in helping you think about how to write these papers. So you now have different policies that you can draw on, and that's available to you as you write your policy brief. So I'm here if you have questions. I'll stick around, but for